Christy Martin had always been an amazing athlete, but the boxing ring was where she shined the brightest.
I actually got involved in boxing back in 1987 while I was in college. I thought, wow, this is so exciting. The adrenaline rush, the crowd response. I was just hooked.
So in the winter of 1990, 22-year-old Christy was excited when her promoters set up a meeting in Bristol, Tennessee, with a professional trainer named Jim Martin.
I didn't know anything about him, had never heard of him before. I thought, well, what the heck?
But the encounter left Christy disheartened.
I went into the gym the first day. Jim was like rude to me. He just knew, you could just feel it, that he didn't want a woman in his boxing gym.
Christy was disappointed by Jim's initial reaction, but his refusal to sign her only fueled her ambition to succeed.
The next day she came back and wanted more, and she came back the following day.
I was always there, day after day, whatever time I was supposed to be there, I was always there giving 100%. He never said anything, but I could just feel there was a change.
Just weeks after they first met, Jim had a change of heart, and he agreed to take Christy under his wing.
The light came on in his head that, wow, she can make a lot of money, and I should hold on to her.
And over the next few weeks, Christy focused solely on her training sessions with Jim. The two spent nearly every minute together.
We trained hours together, and then maybe we'd get something to eat. I didn't know a lot of people there. He didn't know a lot of people there, so we kind of bonded.
Christy soon realized she and Jim had developed feelings for each other. And before long, she found herself revealing a very personal secret.
I told him the truth. I said, you know, I've had relationships with women. I just talked to him and trusted him. This is my coach. This is somebody that's an older person. This is somebody that I can trust.
There was one woman in particular who held a special place in Christy's heart. Her name was Sherry Lusk, and she was an old friend from Christy's hometown.
When I told Jim, he was just like, well, that was then, this is now.
It appeared Jim wasn't about to let Christy's past stop him from being romantically involved in her future.
After one of my fights, he kissed me. You know, as time went on, there was definitely something romantic involved there.
The new couple seemed happy, and in the fall of 1992, Jim asked Christy to marry him. The two moved to Florida and wed at a local courthouse.
I think that I had that love for Jim that you have for a teacher, somebody that you respect. On my wedding day, it felt like if I married him, you know, I will grow to love him, I'll figure it out.
But the truth is hard to bury. And 18 years later, just when Christy was ready to face it, she was sucker punched.
I told Jim, I'm gonna work out, but I just have this terrible, terrible headache. I'm just gonna have to lay down.
I didn't realize the extent of Christy's unhappiness and the control that went on behind closed doors.
And he said, I have something to show you, and I see he has a knife.
Christy had 49 professional wins in the ring, and I think all of those paled in comparison to this.
By the summer of 1993, Christy Martin and her professional boxing trainer, Jim Martin, were still adjusting to their year-old marriage.
The beginning of the marriage with Jim, the love that I had for Jim was more of a respect thing. It was just, when can we fight? You know, how much money are we gonna make?
Christy knew the couple's income was solely dependent on her professional career.
I mean, Jim trained me, but trainers make 10%. And without me, he doesn't have someone to train. The income in my marriage was me. It was my blood, sweat, and tears.
To further complicate matters, Christy had been open with Jim about her preference for women, something Jim did not want to discuss. But if marriage didn't seem to come naturally for the couple, boxing more than made up for it.
Often Jim would be asked in an interview about Christy, risking her life in the ring. And he would always take a deep breath and get choked up. he'd become very emotional.
I always tell everybody I didn't think I'd be kissing one of my fighters.
I thought that he really was looking out for me. I thought at some point, I'm really gonna love this person.
While Christy waited for love, her boxing career took off. In October of 1993, she signed a deal with boxing giant Don King.
That was probably the first time that it sunk into me that I have a true shot at being a professional fighter.
Jim was very proud of Christy. I also think that he knew that the more publicity she got, perhaps the bigger payday down the road.
Christy's professional life had reached an all-time high.
I spent my time at the gym. I trained hard before, so now I really have to train like a maniac because I'm gonna be with the big guns.
As the months went on, Christy won match after match, and Christy and Jim seemed like boxing's all-star duo, especially when Don King extended Christy's contract through 2001.
Jim was very proud of how successful and how well-known Christy had become, and would take a step back and let her enjoy the spotlight.
But outside the ring, Christy's relationship with Jim had taken an alarming turn. It began with a series of surprising threats.
Anything he could find to hurt me, he would, whether that be professionally or personally. It started out from the beginning that he would tell everybody in the boxing world I've had relationships with women.
Jim went on to claim that Christy's sexual preferences could ruin her career. Terrified of losing everything, Christy severed ties with her old flame, Sherry Lusk.
We talked every Christmas. That was our tradition. Until the Christmas I called, and she said, I can't talk anymore. Jim won't let me talk to you. And from that minute on, I knew this girl was in a very, very bad place.
Christy felt completely trapped. And by 2005, any connection she once had with Jim was fading fast.
Jim really never made me feel positive because he was always tearing me down. He had me convinced that my family hated me, the boxing world hated me. He was always the controller, and I was always the controlled, and it never changed.
Christy barely recognized the man she had once trusted. But the lowest punch of all came in the form of a videotape.
Jim had been videotaping me secretly. I found a videotape of us having sex. And so he blackmailed me with the videotape. He was gonna show them to my family, to the boxing community. Basically, I'm gonna use these tapes to keep you here. And I was definitely panicked. My fear was just embarrassment. I didn't want other people seeing me having sex with him.
It was very, very ironic. Christy could be so vicious in the ring, yet she was so submissive and meek in her relationship with her husband.
By 2007, 15 years into their marriage, Christy was completely backed into a corner, just where Jim seemed to want her.
I was miserable. I hated him. I hated the marriage. Divorcing him wasn't really gonna be enough because he was still gonna be here walking around with me, and I wouldn't feel safe.
Christy's battle with Jim was far from over. In fact, the most violent fight of her life was just around the corner.
I begged her not to go. I begged her to do anything but go home.
If Jim couldn't control her in life, Jim could control her in death.
He was gonna give me a little bit more rope, and then either I was gonna hang myself or he was gonna hang me.
By the spring of 2007, professional boxer Christy Martin was having a tough go of it. Jim Martin, her husband and boxing trainer of 16 years, had resorted to threats and intimidation to keep Christy under his control.
He would tell me, "You're not leaving me, I'll kill you." And now I've lived my life, so what do I care about going to jail? Basically, I just kept looking at how am I gonna get out.
Terrified of her husband and with her boxing career winding down, Christy felt she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And that March, Jim came home with what he called a quick fix.
Jim came in from the gym, and he brought in some cocaine. He said that somebody from the gym had given it to him. I've been an athlete all my life. I 100% have been against drugs. So I just left it there. I just sat there for a couple days.
But before Christy knew it, she began to have second thoughts.
It was just miserable, miserable. And I thought, well, maybe, I'll give it a try and we'll see what happens.
Christy tried the cocaine, and before long, she was a daily user with Jim as her supplier.
I kept taking cocaine because it was an escape. I mean, this is so not who I am, but I just had given up.
Christy's drug addiction was now just another way for Jim to control her.
Jim controlled the coke. I stopped going to the gym. Every night was just a sex night, and if I refused, then the cocaine would disappear. So basically, you agree to do anything.
By the spring of 2010, Christy and Jim Martin were on the verge of bankruptcy, and Christy had hit rock bottom. But that March, Christy's nightmare began to change. It all started when an old friend found Christy on a social networking site.
On the side, it popped up, people we suggest you should be friends with. And there was Christy Martin. I immediately hit her name and said, how are you doing? And would you like to be friends? Her response was, classic. Is that what they call it these days?
It was just surprising and good to hear from her.
Christy was thrilled to learn Sherry also lived in Florida and only about 2 hours away. Sherry had always held a special place in Christy's life, and it wasn't long before the two old friends were having a heart-to-heart over the telephone.
And I just opened up and told her, miserable, this marriage is gonna kill me.
Christy's reconnection with Sherry gave her the motivation to get clean. It also spurred her to break things off with Jim.
I just told him, you train me and we'll live under the same roof. Let's try to make some money, get ourselves out of this financial situation that we're in. Once we get back even, you go your way and I'm going mine.
To Christy's surprise, Jim seemed to agree with her plan.
There really wasn't much of a response. I felt like he had realized I can't hold this woman any longer.
The following weekend, Christy invited Sherry to dinner. But that evening, when Christy arrived, she got a disturbing phone call.
The minute she got there, she hugged me and the phone rang. She answered the phone and I could loudly hear Jim saying, I see you and I see the way you greeted her.
Had Jim been following her? Furious, Christy told Sherry she needed to confront Jim and tell him she was leaving right then and there.
And when she got in her car, she looked at me and her last words to me is, this mother's gonna shoot me.
On November 23rd at 4 p.m., Christy entered her house, ready to end her relationship with Jim. But a sudden migraine drove her to her bed instead. Meanwhile, Jim began making phone calls.
While I'm laying there, he gets on the phone. He's saying negative things about me. He won't quit talking loud. The entire time that I'm laying down, I can hear him sharpening his knife.
Christy wasn't sure what Jim was up to, so she called Sherry for support.
I heard Jim enter the room, and he came to her and said, I have something to show you.
He keeps trying to talk to me. I'm like, Jim, I'll be right in there to see what you have as soon as I finish this conversation with Sherry.
As soon as Christy hung up the phone, she saw the surprise Jim had in store.
So I kind of leaned to the side so now I can see behind his back. And I see he has a knife down in his shorts. And then he stabbed me.
As Jim repeatedly plunged a knife into her, Christy attempted to use her fighting skills against the man who had trained her. But Jim was ruthless.
He stabbed me the fourth time, right in my breast. He cut my calf muscle almost completely from my leg. And I just told him, I said, you cannot kill me.
Christy was determined to live, but Jim seemed intent on making sure she didn't. And the worst was yet to come.
How can he let me live? He can't trust me. He better not trust me.
And Christy said that she wasn't going to die in her house and she wasn't going to die on Jim's terms.
I heard the water turn on in the bathroom, so I knew it was my only chance.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong, go to investigation.discovery.com. On November 23, 2010, Christy Martin was engaged in the fight of her life. Her estranged husband Jim had just stabbed her multiple times. But Christy, a professional boxer with a new outlook on life, was determined to survive.
I was trying to get away from him. I just remember begging him and telling him, you know, my parents have been good to you, and don't make them bury their child. He was beating my head on the ground. He was beating my head on the dresser. I'm just laying on the floor, bleeding to death. He would come in and out, in and out. I guess he was seeing if I was dying fast enough.
The final time Jim came back into the bedroom, he brought something that would surely finish the job.
He stood right at my feet and shot me with my own 9mm.
The bullet entered Christy's chest less than 4 inches from her heart. Leaving his wife for dead, Jim went into the bathroom to clean up. But he underestimated his wife's resolve. 4 stab wounds and a gunshot couldn't stop Christy.
And I heard the water turn on in the bathroom, so I knew it was my only chance. So I got up, the gun was laying there, so I grabbed the pink 9mm, and then I just ran out the front door as fast as I could get out.
With a fighter's determination, Christy made it to the open road and flagged down a passing car.
And I got in his back seat, and I told him I'd been shot and stabbed by my husband, and please hurry, don't let me die.
The driver took Christy straight to the hospital. She had narrowly survived a gunshot wound and several stabbings. But Christy's biggest scar wasn't physical.
The hardest thing for me to come to grips with, I think, is how Jim did this to me. I mean, he left me for dead. He thought I was dead.
Even worse was the fact that Jim Martin was still on the loose, hiding out from police who were on a desperate search to find him.
1 week after the attack, Jim was found in some person's backyard in a pair of shorts and a knife in his hand covered in a bloody rag.
Jim was immediately arrested and charged with attempted first-degree murder. While he sat in jail awaiting his trial, Jim pled his innocence. Across town and against all odds, Christy was released from the hospital.
I wasn't gonna let him win. I was in the hospital only 7 days.
And on April 23, 2012, Jim and Christy headed to court.
You know, Christy has portrayed throughout her entire career strength, perseverance, doing the right thing. And Christy had to take that witness stand and talk about the exact opposite, which was the real reality of her life. And the worst part about it was that she had to do that 30 feet from the person who tried to kill her.
He felt like he owned her. He felt like everything Christy was a product of his making, his teaching, his doing. His property had disobeyed him, and he was going to teach it and punish it.
Just 4 days later, on April 27th, a jury convicted Jim Martin of attempted second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in a state prison.
I am free, literally free. I can do what I want, be where I want to be, and it's a feeling I haven't had for a long time.
Today, Christy Martin has a new lease on life.
It's very important for me to tell my story because I feel like people, they have to think, how in the world can this woman, a fighter, how could she have been in a relationship where she was so controlled? And so if it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody.
Christy is also back in the gym and realizes throwing punches was the best medicine.
Why did I go back to boxing? Because I love it, and it was the best therapy that anybody could have ever prescribed for me.
Catherine Blankenship wasn't about to let a major milestone pass her by.
I went to Bunkie High School in Bunkie, Louisiana, and in 2007, I was planning our high school reunion.
That April, after reaching out to several old classmates, Catherine received a surprising email from a former student named Glenn Seymour.
The email surprised me because that was the last person I had expected to hear from. It was out of the blue.
Catherine hadn't seen or spoken to Glenn since the 8th grade, when he had dropped out of school.
Glenn in middle school was quiet. He really kept to himself. We knew of each other, but we weren't considered friends.
But the junior high cliques were far behind them, and Catherine marveled at how much Glenn seemed to have changed.
He told me when he got old enough, he went into the Marines, that he was working for Homeland Security. He would go all across the United States. He would protect people. I thought it was very admirable for someone to do such an amazing job for his country. It touched my heart.
Glenn told Catherine he lived nearby, where he shared custody of his daughter from a previous relationship. Catherine was a single mother herself.
We connected on that level right away. The phone calls between Glenn and I would last hours, sometimes up until I had to go to work the next morning. To have that connection with someone is wonderful.
Before long, the new couple had become inseparable. And as Glenn regaled Catherine with tales of his military prowess, she found herself becoming more and more impressed.
When Catherine told me about Glenn's background in the Marines and then into Homeland Security, I thought, well, Catherine's found somebody that's going to be good, you know.
I saw the display of all the service medals, military medals, the military certificates. I was amazed. So it verified that he was an outstanding man.
As the weeks went by, Glenn and Catherine spent the majority of their time together. And in August of 2007, 4 months after Glenn's first email, Catherine was excited to learn she was pregnant.
Glenn's response to me being pregnant, after about 2 minutes of being shocked, he was very, very happy to have another child on the way. Glenn suggested that he and I moved in together. The decision to move in together was easier than figuring out what soda you wanted to drink for the day. It just fit.
Catherine and Glenn seemed destined for each other, and just 1 month later, Glenn proposed.
I was excited. He seemed brave. He was an outstanding father. He seemed wonderful.
But sometimes the battlefield is hard to leave behind. Just 2 years later, Catherine Blankenship would find herself in the middle of a very different kind of war. In July of 2009, Catherine and Glenn came home to an alarming sight. Their front yard was swarming with uniformed men.
We were watching the house, and Glenn Seymour arrived. We asked if we have permission to search the house.
Guns were everywhere in the house. They were loaded.
Catherine was bewildered. "What is this about?" she said. "Why are you doing this to him? He's one of you."
And that's when Catherine's world changed forever.
Well, I said, I don't think something's right there.
It's just a horrific chain of events, all because of Glenn Seymour's actions.
In the fall of 2007, Catherine Blankenship and her fiancé, Glenn Seymour, were newly pregnant with the couple's first child. Glenn's job kept him away from home more than Catherine would have liked, but she didn't complain.
Glenn said he worked Homeland Security while his cover was offshore as an electrician. Glenn worked a typical offshore rig in the Gulf, which was 14 days home and 14 days at work.
Catherine loved everything about her hard-working husband. But as fall gave way to winter, Catherine realized there was one thing about Glenn that made her rather uncomfortable.
Glenn had a massive gun collection. He said some of it was for his Homeland Security job, some was passed down from his grandfather, and some was just because he liked them. He was infatuated with guns. Just about every time he had a free moment, he was either cleaning it, taking it apart, cleaning it, rearranging them. I made Glenn promise me that he would keep them locked up in the gun cabinets and the key put away to where nobody could get access to them, especially my kid.
Glenn promised to keep his guns under lock and key. And in March of 2008, the safe and happy couple welcomed their first child into the world.
Glenn was amazing. When he was home from work, he let me sleep. He'd get up for the midnight feedings, the midnight changings. He wanted to make sure that he didn't miss a moment in our son's life.
He was good. Glenn, as a father, he was loving. He fed, he changed diapers. He would carry the baby with him when he'd go uptown to the video store, show off the baby. He was a proud father.
That July, when Glenn and Catherine married, it seemed like the final piece of the puzzle.
We were both excited, ready to start that next chapter in our lives. I've been married and divorced. He's been married and divorced. This was the one that's going to stick.
1 month later, Catherine learned she was once again pregnant. But the blissful days would soon be over, as Glenn's past came back to haunt him in a most disturbing way. In March of 2009, Catherine woke up to Glenn screaming in the bed beside her. She tried to wake him up, but Glenn was sound asleep.
He finally woke up and I asked him what was going on, and he told me, he said it was just a flashback.
Glenn explained his flashbacks were terrible dreams from his days fighting on the battlefield.
He said he couldn't explain or talk about what they were. He said they were just about the past, and he'd just leave it at that. So it really scared me.
If Glenn's night terrors weren't enough, his old combat injuries had also started to flare up.
Glenn would often speak of being in pain, which was bad headaches from being injured in the Marines while on duty, being hit with shrapnel in the head.
Glenn already had a doctor's prescription for both pain and anxiety medications. Catherine hoped the pills would be enough to get her husband through his trauma.
I was glad that he was on them, because as long as he's getting help and relief, then it worked, so I was happy with that.
But on May 28, 2009, Catherine came home to an alarming sight.
I had some pain pills in my purse from after I had our child, and I found him digging in my purse for my pain pills. I asked him what he was doing in my purse. He said he was looking for a pen. There was a box of pens on the counter. So after he left, went to another room, I went and got my pain pills, and I hid them.
But a few weeks later, when Catherine went to retrieve her pills from their hiding place, they were gone.
Because I was hurting really bad, and found that they were replaced with an over-the-counter pain reliever. I was highly, highly upset.
Glenn would come here and ask me if I had pain pills. I told Catherine about it, and Catherine couldn't believe it.
I confronted him right away about it. He, of course, denied it over and over. He denied it. He was busted, so I just didn't talk to him for the rest of the day. I didn't want to have any more argument. I just wanted to try to let it go.
Catherine worried that her husband had become an addict, but she was about to find out that Glenn's prescription drugs were the very least of their problems.
There was a lie somewhere, and we didn't know where to begin.
Catherine was bewildered. Why are you doing this to him? He's one of you.
It seemed like my whole world fell apart.
By May of 2009, Catherine Blankenship was deeply worried about her husband, Glenn Seymour.
Glenn was on 2 types of prescription pills, one pain pill for shrapnel in his head, and the other pill was anti-anxiety for his flashbacks.
Glenn had been showing signs of addiction, but Catherine was determined to give her husband the benefit of the doubt, until a shocking turn of events changed everything. On July 22, 2009, Catherine and Glenn were returning home from a shopping trip with the children.
We pull up at our house and we see dozens of men standing outside.
The men appeared to be local police officers and U.S. Marshals.
I didn't know what to think. Glenn had often spoke of his job in Homeland Security, that if somebody shows up at the house, ask him certain questions, you don't say nothing because you don't know nothing.
Glenn assured a nervous Catherine that everything was fine.
He seemed calm. He didn't seem worried. When he went up to the gentleman, I figured something happened and they was just maybe trying to get his side of the story. Finally, I got out to go see what was wrong because I was worried. I didn't know what was going on.
But before Catherine could reach her husband, police officers stepped directly in her path.
We approached Catherine and asked her about searching the house. Catherine was bewildered. "What is this about?" she said. "Why are you doing this to him? He's one of you."
The guy asked me if Glenn had a badge. I informed him yes. He asked me if I knew where the badge was. I told him yes. So I walked the guy inside the house. I went to the bedroom where it was last, and the badge wasn't there.
Catherine had a million questions, and she would soon get some very disturbing answers as officers sat her down at her kitchen table and explained why they were there.
Glenn had walked into a pharmacy. Glenn was hoping to get prescription pills, pain medication from this pharmacist without going to visit a doctor. Glenn had said he was a United States Marshal. This was caught on video. Glenn was dressed in SWAT attire and also stated that he had injured himself in the training and he needed pain relief immediately.
The pharmacist had not given Glenn his pills and had quickly called 911. Glenn Seymour's name was turned over to law enforcement, and they immediately started doing some digging.
We did his background investigation, determined that no law enforcement agency that we contacted had him in employment.
Officers discovered that while Glenn Seymour was an offshore oil rig electrician, he was not, nor had he ever been, a Homeland Security officer.
The moment that the officer told me that Glenn was never Homeland Security, it seemed like my whole world fell apart. My whole marriage was a lie.
I could tell that Catherine was basically taken by Glenn Seymour with his lies. I explained to Catherine that Glenn Seymour was not an officer of the law and that we had certain items in his house that we want to look for. She was very compliant. She signed a consent to search.
And as soon as I signed the paper, 5 guys rushed in the house, and they started taking everything that belonged to Glenn.
Catherine watched in tears as the real officers carried Glenn's belongings right past him, where he sat handcuffed on the front lawn and flanked by police.
No way in the world did I expect to find what we uncovered. We retrieved tens of thousands of dollars worth of weapons, what people would deem assault weapons, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition. Glenn Seymour also had homemade suppressors, which are silencers that mostly people use to muffle the sound of a rifle.
When one of the officers came from down the hall with a gun in his hand, I asked him where he got it from. He said it came from the nursery closet behind a duffel bag. The guns in the nursery were my baby sleeves. That dropped my heart.
Officers also gathered up the military plaques and medals Catherine had been so proud of.
So I go back out and make initial contact with Glenn Seymour. And my basic question to Glenn Seymour was, "You're a Marine?" And Glenn Seymour's answer was, "Yes, I was, but I was honorably discharged because of my wounds." And he pointed to his head area. And there was no scars, no marks to prove it. And I brought that to his attention.
And that was all it took for Glenn to finally reveal the truth.
Glenn broke down crying. He said, "I've never been in any armed forces. Those medals were from a dead Marine that died in a car wreck. And I ordered the certificates and dog tags offline." So my stomach just kind of sunk. Glenn Seymour was living a life of lies, and his wife was buying into it.
By this time, I didn't know what was real, what was lies, what happened, what didn't happen. I didn't know what to think.
Glenn Seymour was placed under arrest for impersonating a federal law enforcement agent. But before police put Glenn in a squad car, Catherine was given 5 minutes to talk to her husband.
He finally told me, he said, "I'm just so sorry. We'll figure it out when I get home."
Catherine was desperate for answers, and she knew that things looked bad for her husband. But Catherine had no idea how much worse things were about to get.
That phone call destroyed everything.
It was a blow to all of us.
I think Glenn thought it was the end, and he took a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong, go to investigation.discovery.com. On July 22, 2009, Catherine Blankenship was shocked when her husband, Glenn Seymour, was arrested for impersonating a law enforcement officer. But when Glenn called her from jail, he insisted he was innocent and blamed the police.
He said the cops are lying. I constantly asked him what was going on. He just didn't know. He had no clue. He wouldn't tell me anything. At the end of that conversation, I still felt like everything was unresolved. So I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, but my gut was telling me not to.
Catherine wasn't sure she could trust her husband, especially when she found out he was giving federal agents an entirely different story.
Glenn admitted to over 100 impersonations of a police officer where he tried to gain some sort of favor. I think Glenn was thinking, I know I'm in trouble now. I think he was remorseful for it. I think he was remorseful for getting caught.
After 2 days in jail, Glenn was released on bail while he awaited trial.
I told Glenn when he got home from jail, as long as I knew everything and he'd be honest with me, then we could work on getting our marriage back on track. And he looked me in the eye and told me that I knew everything and there was no more secrets.
But Catherine kept pushing until her husband finally told her the devastating truth.
He said he was not in the Marines. He tried going and he failed the hearing test. Told me he didn't understand why he lied. He just wanted it so bad. That's something that he has always wanted in his heart and soul. So he thought that if he lied about it so long, that he would believe it.
Even though Glenn's entire past was made up, Catherine was still willing to stand by her husband.
I still loved him. I loved the man he was to me and the kids. The lies that Glenn told to me didn't make him the person he is. That didn't matter to me. That's not the man that was my husband, the father to my kids. I don't care if he was in Homeland Security or not. That's not the man I fell in love with. That's just something from the past.
Catherine and Glenn vowed to move forward. But as the days went by, Catherine realized putting the past behind them was going to be easier said than done.
He still made comments about he needed to get his guns back. He didn't feel like a man because he didn't have his guns to protect his family. I tell him, you don't need guns to protect your family. As long as you're here, that's protection. He didn't believe it.
Although Catherine was ready to forgive Glenn, the state of Louisiana wasn't as willing. Glenn would face 10 to 20 years in prison if convicted. So Catherine suggested that Glenn return to work to clear his head. But when he arrived back on the oil rig, Glenn found that news of his phony career had traveled fast.
Glenn called me, and he was about in tears. I could hear it in his voice. He was so embarrassed because there were two guys over there making fun of him. He said he felt like less of a man. I told him, men can be boys. You're a bigger person than that. Don't worry about it.
The heckling got the best of Glenn. 2 days later, Catherine got a heartbreaking phone call from the oil rig.
It was one of his bosses from work told me that Glenn had passed away. He had hung himself. And they tried to revive him. There was nothing that they could do. I was still in love with him. When I got that phone call, it seemed to really confirm all the lies that he couldn't live with anymore. I felt like my world just crashed.
Catherine and those investigating Glenn's case will never really know why Glenn created such a tangled web of lies.
Impersonating a Homeland Security special agent or Marine is a serious crime. I asked, why would you do this, Glenn? And he just said, I wanted my kids to look up to me. I want to be a hero to them. My basic answer to him was, Glenn, you're supplying food, you're supplying shelter. You are a hero to them.
I would often tell Glenn that being in the service isn't the reason I loved him, isn't the reason I fell in love with him. He was a wonderful father, husband. He worked for us, he lived for us. Being in the service, that didn't matter.
Today, Catherine Blankenship pours her energy into her children and takes things one day at a time. Although she feels ready to move forward, Catherine is not thinking about romance just yet.
I wish Catherine would find somebody to make her happy. She deserves it.
I'm single. I'm not dating. I figure whenever time is right, I'll be blessed with that person.
And when that time comes, Catherine will have learned a thing or two about trust.
I've learned that if your gut tells you something's not adding up, no matter what it is, check it out. You save yourself a whole lot of heartache that way.
First, it was just a sound. A single knock, sharp and impatient, cutting through the quiet of a small Illinois street just before dawn. No one answered. The porch light flickered once, then stayed dark. Inside the house, a clock kept ticking, steady and indifferent, counting seconds that no one would ever hear again. This is where the story begins. Not with a scream, not with blood, but with silence. The kind of silence that becomes permanent. The kind that turns into a cold case. Illinois, spring of 1995. A town small enough that most people still recognized each other's cars, where the local diner served the same breakfast specials every morning and high school football games were the loudest events of the week. Nothing about that day suggested disaster. No storm warnings. No police sirens. No frantic phone calls. Just an ordinary morning that would quietly fracture a community for decades. The house sat near the edge of town, modest, unremarkable, blending in with the others on the block. Inside lived a life that appeared routine from the outside. A schedule. A job. Familiar routines that neighbors noticed only when they suddenly stopped. When mail began piling up. When the trash cans weren't rolled back from the curb. When lights stayed off long after sunset. By the time police arrived, something already felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just off. The front door was unlocked. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. The kind of scene that makes investigators uneasy because it refuses to explain itself. This wasn't chaos. This was absence. The missing person report was filed quietly, almost apologetically. Friends told officers the same thing over and over. They wouldn't just disappear. Family insisted there had been no warning, no threats, no reason to run. This was someone with roots here, with plans, with obligations that mattered. And yet the house stood empty. Police began with what they always do. Timelines. Phone records. Last known sightings. The final confirmed moment when anyone could say with certainty, "I saw them." That moment led back to the night before. A short drive. A familiar route. A stop that should have taken minutes, not years. Witnesses came forward hesitantly at first. A neighbor who thought they heard a car door slam late at night but didn't look outside. Someone else who remembered seeing headlights pause near the house longer than usual. Ordinary details that, at the time, felt meaningless. The kind people forget by morning. The kind that become crucial only after it's too late. Investigators canvassed the area. Fields. Ditches. Wooded patches near the highway. Nothing. No clothing. No personal items. No trace that could point in any direction. It was as if the person had stepped out of their life and vanished mid-stride. Rumors filled the vacuum almost immediately. Affairs. Secret debts. A possible argument overheard weeks earlier. In a town like this, speculation spreads faster than facts. Everyone had a theory. None of them could be proven. None of them explained why there was no evidence, no struggle, no trail. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The case lost its urgency as newer emergencies demanded attention. Detectives reassigned. Leads followed, then quietly closed. Each time the phone rang at the police station, there was hope. Each time it wasn't that call, disappointment settled a little deeper. The family kept waiting. Waiting for news. Waiting for answers. Waiting for the knock that would bring clarity instead of confusion. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. An empty chair became part of every gathering. The town adjusted, but it never forgot. By the end of the year, the file was labeled with words no one wants attached to their name. Cold case. Not because investigators stopped caring, but because the case stopped giving anything back. No fingerprints. No DNA. No verified sightings. Just unanswered questions stacked neatly inside a manila folder. Over the years, the story faded into background noise. New families moved in. Younger residents heard the case as a rumor, something that happened before my time. The house changed owners. The street kept living. But somewhere, locked in an evidence room, the silence remained. Then years later, long after most people assumed the truth would never surface, a phone rang. It wasn't a dramatic call. No confession. No emotional breakdown. Just a voice on the other end of the line, measured and careful, choosing words slowly. An anonymous tip. Someone claiming to know something they hadn't known before, or hadn't dared to say. The information didn't point directly to a suspect. It didn't explain everything. But it did something far more dangerous. It challenged the version of events everyone had accepted. It suggested the disappearance wasn't random, that it wasn't voluntary, that it wasn't as clean as it had appeared. Detectives reopened the file. Boxes were pulled from storage. Old notes reread with fresh eyes. Names that had once seemed insignificant were suddenly circled in red. The town didn't know it yet, but the past was about to intrude on the present. Because cold cases don't stay buried forever. They wait. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, anonymous, unexpected, to crack the silence that's held for decades. The call didn't come with a name, but it came with weight. The kind that settles into a room long after the receiver is placed back on the hook. Detectives sat quietly for a moment, replaying the words in their heads, aware that anonymous tips were nothing new, but also knowing that most cold cases don't get calls like this. Not decades later, not with this level of detail, not with this particular choice of facts. The voice hadn't sounded frantic or confused. It sounded deliberate, as if the caller had rehearsed what to say, trimmed away everything unnecessary, and left only what could no longer be ignored. The tip didn't accuse anyone outright. It didn't point to a body or a weapon. Instead, it questioned a night that investigators thought they already understood. It suggested that the timeline, the backbone of the entire case, had been wrong from the very beginning. That the disappearance didn't happen when police believed it did. That someone had been present who was never accounted for. Someone who had blended into the background so perfectly they were overlooked. Detectives pulled the original timeline back onto the table. Minute by minute. Phone logs. Witness statements. The final confirmed sighting. The last outgoing call. The last time the porch light was seen on. At the time, everything had seemed to line up neatly enough. Now, with the anonymous tip echoing in their ears, those same details felt unstable, like pieces from different puzzles forced together. The caller mentioned a vehicle, one that had been dismissed early on as irrelevant. A car parked briefly near the house late that night. Not unusual, investigators had thought. Friends stopped by. Neighbors came and went. But the caller insisted the vehicle wasn't local, that it didn't belong, that its presence wasn't accidental. Back in 1995, a neighbor had casually mentioned seeing unfamiliar headlights idling at the curb. The note was buried in the report, overshadowed by stronger leads that went nowhere. Now it resurfaced, no longer minor, no longer ignorable. Detectives wondered how many other small details had been quietly filed away, because they didn't fit the narrative of a clean disappearance. The investigation shifted from what was missing to who had been overlooked. They revisited interviews with friends and coworkers, listened again to recorded statements, catching hesitations they hadn't noticed before. Long pauses, vague answers to simple questions. In 1995, those pauses had been chalked up to stress, grief, shock. Now they sounded like something else. The anonymous tip also raised another unsettling possibility. That the person who disappeared may have trusted whoever was with them that night. There were no signs of forced entry because none were needed. No struggle because there was no immediate reason to resist. If true, it explained the eerie calm of the scene. The unlocked door. The absence of chaos. The sense that the house had been left willingly, at least at first. Police returned to the street where it all began. The houses looked different now. Fresh paint. New fences. Children who hadn't even been born in 1995 riding bikes along the sidewalk. But the geography hadn't changed. Distances remained the same. Sightlines were identical. Investigators stood where neighbors once stood, trying to understand what could and couldn't be seen in the dark. They knocked on doors again. Some residents remembered. Others had moved in years later and knew the story only as a rumor. A few longtime neighbors hesitated, their eyes darting away as if the past was something best left undisturbed. One of them mentioned, almost offhandedly, that there had always been talk about that night. Talk no one ever put on record. Whispers of an argument. A raised voice. A car door slamming harder than usual. It was never reported. No one wanted to get involved. In a small town, being wrong can follow you longer than being silent. The case file grew thicker. Old photographs were scanned into digital databases. Handwritten notes typed out and cross-referenced. Detectives searched for patterns that had been invisible before. A name appeared again and again on the periphery of the investigation, not as a suspect, not even as a person of interest, but as someone who was always nearby. Someone who had an explanation for everything and no explanation for nothing. Back in 1995, that name had been dismissed quickly. Alibis checked. Stories accepted. The department was understaffed, overworked, and under pressure to move forward. There was no smoking gun, no reason to push harder. Or so it seemed. The anonymous tip suggested otherwise. It hinted at resentment. At something unresolved. At a connection deeper than police records showed. Detectives began mapping relationships. Who knew whom, who spent time together outside of work, who had something to gain from silence. The picture that emerged wasn't dramatic. It was mundane, and that made it far more dangerous. Cold cases rarely hinge on monsters hiding in plain sight. They collapse under the weight of ordinary people making one irreversible decision. As word spread quietly through the department that the case was active again, tension followed. Some officers remembered working it the first time. Others were new, unburdened by past assumptions. They asked questions no one had thought to ask before. Why was that witness never re-interviewed? Why was that lead dropped after a single phone call? Why did everyone assume the disappearance happened after midnight? The anonymous caller hadn't provided proof, but they had given investigators something more powerful than evidence: doubt. Doubt crept into every corner of the case. The night didn't feel as simple anymore. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt guarded. Detectives requested records that hadn't existed in 1995. Cell phone pings, financial transactions, databases that could track movements across counties. Slowly, fragments began to align in ways they never had before. A credit card transaction here. A gas station receipt there. Nothing definitive, but enough to suggest that someone's story didn't match reality. The town still didn't know. Life went on as usual, but under the surface the past was stirring. Old loyalties were being tested. Old secrets threatened to surface. And somewhere the anonymous caller waited. Maybe they thought they had said too much. Maybe they thought they hadn't said enough. Maybe they believed the truth could no longer stay buried now that it had been disturbed. Because once a cold case starts to warm up, it doesn't cool down quietly. It demands attention. It forces questions into places that have stayed comfortable for far too long. And the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the disappearance in Illinois in 1995 wasn't an accident, wasn't a mystery of chance. It was the result of choices made in the dark, choices that someone somewhere had been living with ever since. The silence was cracking. The first thing investigators did after reopening the case was something deceptively simple. They stopped asking what had happened and started asking who had benefited from everyone believing nothing had happened at all. It changed the temperature in the room. Suddenly, the familiar faces from old reports looked different under fluorescent lights. Old alibis were no longer statements of fact. They were hypotheses waiting to be broken. The name that kept resurfacing sat quietly in the margins of the file, never bolded, never underlined. A person who had been interviewed early, cooperated fully, and then slipped back into normal life without friction. In 1995, their account had been neat. Too neat. A timeline that fit perfectly until it didn't. When detectives overlaid the anonymous tip onto that timeline, a gap appeared. Small. Just enough for doubt to seep through. They pulled the interview tapes from storage, the analog hiss crackling as the voices came back to life. There it was again, the calm tone, the steady cadence, the way answers arrived a fraction of a second too late, as if they were being selected rather than recalled. No contradictions on the surface. But beneath it, something felt rehearsed. Investigators mapped the night again, this time starting earlier. Hours before anyone believed the disappearance occurred. They traced movements through receipts and pay stubs, through time cards punched without ceremony, through habits so routine no one thought to question them. And that's where the story bent. A stop that had never been documented. A short drive that didn't appear on any report. A period of time no one could account for with certainty. In 1995, that blank space was invisible because no one was looking for it. Now it glowed. They drove the route themselves late at night, windows down, engine idling at intersections the way it would have back then. They noted how little traffic passed after midnight, how headlights carried for blocks, how a car parked too long would have been noticed by someone, anyone, if they'd been paying attention. But people rarely pay attention to what doesn't demand it. The anonymous tip had mentioned a confrontation. Not loud, not violent. A conversation that escalated quietly, the way arguments do when both sides believe they're right. Investigators wondered who else might have heard something but dismissed it. Who might have chosen sleep over curiosity. They returned to one witness in particular, someone who had given a brief statement in 1995 and never heard from police again. Back then, the witness had been younger, less confident, eager not to cause trouble. Now, decades later, they sat across from detectives with a different posture. Age does that. It loosens what fear once tightened. The witness hesitated, then said something they had never said before. That they had heard voices that night. Not shouting. Not screaming. Just tension. The kind that makes you pause, then convince yourself it's none of your business. The kind you forget until someone asks the right question years later. Why didn't you say anything? Detectives asked. Because no one asked me that, the witness replied. That answer settled heavily into the room. As the investigation widened, pressure followed. People noticed unfamiliar cars parked near the old house. Notebooks. Cameras. The past had returned, and it wasn't subtle. Conversations stopped when detectives entered diners. Eye contact lingered just a moment too long. One person, interviewed again after nearly 30 years, bristled at the questions. Their story hadn't changed, but their patience had. They asked why police were digging this up now. Why they couldn't let the dead rest. It was an odd choice of words, considering no body had ever been found. Investigators didn't comment. They just noted it. The anonymous tipster called again. This time the voice sounded different. Less controlled. Still careful but edged with urgency. They referenced a specific location. A place searched briefly in 1995 and cleared without fanfare. A stretch of land altered by time, development, and weather. The caller didn't claim to know what was there now. Only what had been there once. Detectives pulled old maps. Aerial photos from the mid-90s. What had been fields were now parking lots. What had been tree lines were now roads. Excavation permits had been filed years ago. Dirt moved, earth reshaped. If something had been hidden, it might already be gone, or sealed beneath layers no one thought to look under. The possibility was maddening. Cold cases often end not because the truth is hidden, but because it's been erased by time. Construction. Erosion. Progress. Still, detectives followed the lead. They spoke with contractors, pulled records, traced where soil had been relocated. It was tedious, unglamorous work. The kind that doesn't make headlines. The kind that solves cases. Meanwhile, relationships came under scrutiny. Not just romantic ones, but financial ties, favors exchanged, quiet debts owed. Investigators discovered that two people connected to the case had once shared more than proximity. They shared history. A falling out no one had documented. A resentment that never made it into any report. In 1995, motive had been the weakest part of the case. No obvious enemies. No threats. No money missing. Now motive looked less like a single spark and more like a slow burn. Frustration. Fear of exposure. The pressure of secrets that refused to stay buried. The town felt it. Old conversations resurfaced. People asked each other questions they'd avoided for decades. Did you know? Did you suspect? Should we have said something? The house where it began stood quietly, unaware of its role in the storm building around it. Inside, nothing from that night remained. New paint. New floors. New lives layered over the old. But detectives knew that places remember even when people pretend not to. As evidence accumulated, so did resistance. One individual declined to speak without an attorney. Perfectly legal. Perfectly telling. Another suddenly remembered being out of town that night. Something they'd never mentioned before. Memory, it seemed, was becoming selective. The anonymous caller went silent. Days passed. Weeks. Investigators worried they'd pushed too hard. Scared the only person willing to talk. Or maybe the caller had said all they intended to say. Maybe conscience had limits. Then, buried in a stack of newly digitized records, A detail emerged that stopped everything. A discrepancy so small it had survived unnoticed for decades. A timestamp, off by minutes. Minutes that placed someone exactly where they claimed they hadn't been. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to change the direction of the case entirely. Because cold cases don't unravel all at once. They fracture along stress lines. And once the first crack appears, the structure can't hold forever. Somewhere someone knew that. And they were running out of places to hide. The timestamp didn't scream. It whispered. A quiet inconsistency buried in a database that didn't exist when the case first went cold. Back in 1995, no one questioned the precision of clocks printed on receipts or logs. They were treated as approximate good enough. Now they were evidence. And this one was wrong or someone wanted it to be. Detectives stared at the number, then at each other. Few minutes. That was all. But those minutes stretched the timeline in ways that couldn't be ignored. They placed a familiar name near the house after they had sworn, repeatedly, that they were already gone. Already home. Already asleep. Investigators didn't rush. Cold cases punish haste. Instead, they rebuilt the night again. This time anchoring everything to that timestamp. Traffic patterns. Store closing times. Streetlight cycles. The way small towns slow down after midnight. When they were finished, the story no longer flowed smoothly. It stuttered. They brought the person back in. The interview room hadn't changed much over the years. Same table. Same dull walls. Same sense of quiet pressure. But the person sitting across from detectives had changed. Lines at the corners of their eyes. A stiffness in their posture. A confidence that bordered on irritation. Detectives didn't accuse. They asked, "Where exactly were you between these times? Can you walk us through it again?" The answers came quickly at first, practiced. Then slower. The person paused, corrected themselves, shifted details that once seemed locked in place. When the timestamp was mentioned, the room tightened. That must be a mistake, they said. Those systems weren't reliable back then. Maybe detectives replied. But maybe not. They asked about the vehicle. The unfamiliar one neighbors had mentioned. The one dismissed as irrelevant. The person shrugged. Said they didn't recall seeing anything unusual. Said people came and went all the time. But their foot tapped under the table. Outside the room, detectives compared notes. The story still technically worked, but it required believing that every anomaly was coincidence. That every inconsistency was error. That every witness who remembered something differently was mistaken. Cold cases survive on that kind of generosity. Solved cases do not. Investigators expanded the scope. They looked not just at where people said they were, but why they said it. What they stood to lose if the truth shifted even slightly. Careers. Reputations. Families built on foundations no one wanted examined too closely. Another interview revealed something else. A coworker recalled a comment made days after the disappearance. Casual. Almost joking. Something about letting things cool down. At the time it meant nothing. Now it sounded like someone knew there was heat to escape. Detectives felt the case tightening around a small group of people. Not a conspiracy. Not a ring. Just a cluster of overlapping loyalties and silences. Each one insignificant alone. Together suffocating. They followed the financial trail next. Not for missing money but for stress. Late payments. Loans taken quietly. A sudden need for cash that coincided uncomfortably with the disappearance. Nothing illegal on its own. Everything suspicious in context. One account stood out. A withdrawal made shortly after the night in question. Not large enough to raise alarms. Just enough to matter to someone under pressure. When asked about it years later, the explanation was vague. Purchase. Favor. Something forgotten. Investigators didn't press. Not yet. The anonymous caller resurfaced through a different channel. An email this time. Short. Sparse. No emotion. Just a sentence that landed like a weight dropped into water. You're asking the right questions but the wrong people. It rattled the team. Had they missed someone? Or was the sender trying to redirect attention to muddy waters that were finally clearing? Cold cases attract manipulation once they start moving. People who were comfortable with silence grow nervous when it breaks. Detectives reviewed the entire cast again. Family. Friends. Peripheral figures. One name, absent from most discussions, resurfaced quietly. Someone who had been in town briefly around that time. Someone whose presence was documented but never explored. They dug. The person had left Illinois shortly after 1995. No forwarding address. No record of contact with anyone from the town afterward. At the time it seemed unremarkable. People move. Lives change. Now it looked like escape. Tracking them wasn't easy. Years blur records. Names change. People disappear into ordinary lives. But persistence pays. Eventually, investigators found a lead. A state away. A different job. A different name spelling. They requested an interview. The response was immediate and defensive. Why now? Why me? I barely remember that time. But they remembered more than they admitted. They recalled being at the house. Not that night, they insisted. Just earlier. Just passing through. Their account conflicted subtly with others. Not enough to be caught in a lie, but enough to raise questions. When detectives asked why they left town so suddenly, the answer came too fast. An opportunity. A fresh start. No reason to stay. But people rarely flee fresh starts. They flee endings. As pressure built, cracks formed elsewhere. A long-retired officer reviewed the reopened case and admitted something that had haunted them for years. That they had wanted to push harder back then. That something hadn't felt right. That they were told politely to move on. No paper trail supported this. Just memory. Regret. The case was no longer just about a disappearance. It was about mischances. About how easily a quiet town, a busy department, and a tidy explanation can bury the truth. Detectives prepared search warrants. Carefully. Deliberately. Not to find a body. Not yet. But to find something else. Confirmation that the past had been altered intentionally. One warrant targeted an old storage space connected to the original person of interest. Long forgotten. Untouched for years. Inside, boxes sat layered in dust. Personal effects. Old paperwork. Nothing dramatic. Then they found it. An item that shouldn't have been there. An object that contradicted a statement given decades earlier. Small. Ordinary. Undeniable. It wasn't enough to close the case. But it was enough to change the stakes. Because now, silence was no longer neutral. It was active. It was protective. And someone somewhere knew that the story they'd lived with since 1995 was beginning to collapse. The town felt it before it heard it. That uneasy sense that something long buried was clawing its way back into the light. And once that happens, there's no turning back. The object didn't look dangerous. It wasn't a weapon, wasn't stained, wasn't dramatic. It sat in a box like something forgotten on purpose, the kind of thing people convince themselves doesn't matter anymore. But it mattered. Because it shouldn't have existed in that place, and it shouldn't have survived that long if the story everyone had told was true. Detectives didn't announce the discovery. They didn't confront anyone immediately. Cold cases don't reward theatrics. They reward patience. The item was cataloged, photographed, bagged. Every step deliberate. Every movement recorded. Because if this case was going to break, it would do so under scrutiny that left no room for excuses. They cross-checked it against old statements. Line by line. Sentence by sentence. There it was, a direct contradiction. Not ambiguous. Not interpretive. A simple fact that could not coexist with what had been sworn to years earlier. The lie wasn't elaborate. Didn't need to be. It was a single omission. A small deviation from the truth that had been protected by time and assumption. Detectives revisited the interview transcripts again. Listening for moments where that object should have come up. Never did. Not once. And that absence spoke louder than anything said. They brought the person back in. This time the atmosphere was different. The casual confidence was gone. The questions were the same, but the tone wasn't. The detectives let silence stretch longer than comfort allowed. People talk to fill silence. Especially when they know something is coming. When the object was placed on the table, there was a pause. Just a beat. But in that beat, everything shifted. Where did this come from? Detectives asked. The answer arrived late. Too late. Confusion followed. A claim of faulty memory. Of time blurring details. Of not realizing its significance. But memory doesn't fabricate physical objects. The explanation unraveled quickly. Each attempt to clarify only deepened the hole. Dates were adjusted. Locations softened. Certainty dissolved into speculation. The story that once sounded airtight now felt improvised. Outside the room, investigators exchanged looks. They weren't looking at a confession. They were looking at fear. They broadened the net again, this time targeting conversations that occurred after the disappearance. Who talked to whom? Who checked in? Who avoided certain people? Patterns emerged that hadn't existed on paper before. A sudden distance between once close acquaintances. Calls that stopped abruptly. A friendship that ended without explanation. One witness, long reluctant, finally agreed to speak openly. They described a conversation from the summer of 1995, weeks after the disappearance. Casual meeting. A comment made in frustration. Something like, "It's over now. You don't have to worry about it anymore." At the time it sounded like reassurance. Now it sounded like knowledge. Investigators pressed gently. Who said it? Where were you? Why did it stick with you all these years? The witness swallowed hard before answering. Because they'd always known it was wrong. They just didn't think anyone would ever ask again. Another lead surfaced from an unexpected place. An old voicemail tape. Nearly discarded during a house cleanout years earlier. A relative had kept it without listening, afraid of what it might contain. Now, with the case active again, they handed it over. The audio was degraded. Static swallowed parts of the message. But the voice was unmistakable. The tone tense. The words clipped. "I can't keep doing this," the voice said. "You said this would end." No date. No names. But investigators recognized the cadence. They compared it to known recordings. The match wasn't perfect. Didn't need to be. It was close enough to matter. As pieces accumulated, pressure radiated outward. The town buzzed with restrained curiosity. No official statements. No press conferences. Just the quiet awareness that something old was moving again. That someone somewhere was being asked questions they never expected to answer. The anonymous tipster contacted investigators one last time. This time there was no mystery. No misdirection. Just exhaustion. The message was short. "I didn't think it would go this far. But it has to." Detectives wanted more. Names. Proof. Specifics. None came. But the tone was different now. Less guarded. Almost relieved. They turned their attention back to the land referenced earlier. The place altered by construction. Ground-penetrating radar was considered. Then dismissed. Too much had changed. Instead, they focused on records. Where the soil had gone. Which trucks had hauled it away. Which sites received fill during that period. One location surfaced repeatedly. A remote dumping area used briefly during a road project in the mid-90s. Officially closed. Barely documented. The kind of place that existed in paperwork more than memory. Investigators visited it at dawn. Fog hung low. The ground uneven. Nothing marked. Nothing obvious. Just earth that had been moved once and left alone since. They walked the perimeter. Not searching for remains, searching for confirmation that the timeline allowed for something to be hidden there. It did. Back at the station, tension peaked. Detectives prepared subpoenas. Re-interviews. They knew that once they crossed a certain line, cooperation would vanish entirely. People would lawyer up. Doors would close. So they chose carefully. They confronted the person of interest again, this time with everything laid out, not as accusations but as facts. The timestamp, the object, the voicemail, the witness statements. Each one alone survivable. Together crushing. The response was silence. Then denial. Then anger. Then something else, something close to panic. The person asked for a break. Asked for water. Asked if they were being charged. Not yet, detectives replied. But the case had shifted irreversibly. It was no longer about what might have happened. It was about why so many people had worked, consciously or not, to keep it buried. Cold cases don't just expose crimes. They expose systems of avoidance, of convenience, of collective decisions to look away. As night fell over the town, investigators stayed late, reviewing what they had. They knew they were close, not to closure but to truth. And truth, once uncovered, doesn't negotiate. Somewhere someone else felt it too. That tightening sensation in the chest. That awareness that time was no longer an ally. That the silence they depended on was thinning, stretching, ready to tear. Because the past doesn't stay quiet forever. It waits. And when it speaks, it does so with everything it has. The shift was subtle at first. Not in the evidence but in the air around the case. Phones rang differently now. Conversations ended faster. People who once spoke freely began measuring their words, glancing toward doors as if the past itself might be listening. Detectives noticed it immediately. This was no longer an old mystery being dusted off. This was an active threat to someone's carefully constructed life. The person at the center of the investigation didn't return calls as quickly. Their attorney did. Polite, firm, asking about scope, asking about intent, asking whether this was still an inquiry or something more. Detectives answered carefully. Cold cases don't benefit from overplaying their hand. Not yet. Instead, they turned to corroboration. Every claim, every denial, every moment of silence had to be tested against something external. Something indifferent to human memory. Something that didn't care about reputation or fear. They found it in utility records. Back in 1995, power usage was barely considered relevant. Now it was a map. A pattern of lights switching on and off. Of appliances running. Of homes that were supposedly empty showing signs of activity. One address in particular showed usage during hours when its occupant claimed to be elsewhere. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, consistent, damning. Detectives laid it next to the timeline. Fit too well. They revisited the night again. This time from the perspective of opportunity. Who had the means? Who had the access? Who could move unnoticed without raising alarms? The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Someone trusted. Someone expected. Someone whose presence wouldn't have triggered fear. That realization reframed everything. The disappearance wasn't sudden. It wasn't chaotic. It unfolded in stages. A conversation. A decision. A moment where walking away was no longer an option. The calmness of the scene wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Investigators interviewed another witness who had avoided police for years. Someone who had once been close, then deliberately distant. They sat rigidly, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the table. When asked why they never came forward, the answer came out in a whisper. I didn't think anyone would believe me. They described a meeting days after the disappearance. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just tense. A warning disguised as advice. Something like, you should stop asking questions. People get hurt that way. The witness laughed nervously as they recalled it, as if trying to convince themselves it hadn't mattered. But it had. It had kept them silent for decades. Detectives asked who said it. The name landed heavily. It wasn't new. But hearing it spoken aloud, connected to intimidation rather than coincidence, changed its weight entirely. At this point, the investigation wasn't just uncovering what happened in 1995. It was uncovering how fear had been used afterward. How silence had been maintained not through violence, but through implication. Through the suggestion that digging too deep had consequences. The anonymous tipster resurfaced again. This time not with information but with urgency. The message was brief and unencrypted. Almost careless. They're panicking. Detectives believed it. They accelerated. Subpoenas were issued for phone records tied to numbers long inactive. Some came back empty. Others didn't. One number, used briefly in the mid-90s and then abandoned, showed repeated contact with two individuals already under scrutiny. The calls clustered tightly around the night of the disappearance, and then stopped forever. Burner phones weren't common in 1995, but they existed. Investigators tracked where that number was activated. A convenience store miles from town. A place with no cameras back then, no records kept. Just a receipt timestamped within the newly expanded window of suspicion. The web tightened. They brought the person of interest in again, not to accuse but to observe. Stress changes people. It reveals cracks that rehearsed stories can't cover forever. The person arrived defensive, exhausted, irritated by the persistence of the questions. Detectives asked about the phone. The denial was immediate. They asked about the utility usage. Confusion followed. They asked about the witness who remembered the warning. Anger surfaced. Each reaction was logged, not for what was said but for how it was said. The rise in voice, the clenched jaw, the way control slipped then snapped back into place. At one point, the person leaned forward and said, "You're ruining people's lives over nothing." Detectives didn't respond, because they knew that people who feel safe don't say that. Behind the scenes, prosecutors began reviewing the file. Quietly, carefully. Cold cases demand more than suspicion. They demand resilience under attack. Every move would be challenged, every assumption interrogated. The question wasn't whether something had happened. It was whether enough could be proven without a body. Then came the breakthrough no one expected. A retired contractor, contacted as part of the land investigation, mentioned something almost casually. That during the mid-90s project, one load of soil had been dumped separately. Off the books. Not maliciously, he insisted, just a shortcut to save time. He couldn't remember exactly where. Just that it wasn't where it was supposed to go. Detectives asked him to think harder. He did. The location he described wasn't on any official map. It wasn't documented. It was the kind of place no one would search unless they already suspected it. A natural depression near an abandoned access road. Overgrown now. Forgotten. They went there the next morning. No shovels. No excavation. Just observation. The land bore subtle scars. Inconsistent vegetation. A depression that didn't quite match the surrounding terrain. Not proof, but promise. They marked it, photographed it, logged it. Back at the station, the pressure was palpable. Everyone knew they were approaching a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Once they dug, literally or figuratively, there would be no quiet retreat. The anonymous tipster went silent again. Maybe they'd said all they could. Maybe they were afraid. Or maybe they were watching, waiting to see if the truth would finally surface without them having to speak again. As night fell, detectives sat with the case spread across the table. Photos, transcripts, maps, timelines. 30 years of silence converging into something sharp and unavoidable. They knew what came next would define everything. Because cold cases don't end gently. They end when the weight of truth becomes heavier than the fear of consequences. And that weight was about to fall. Morning came without relief. The sky over Illinois was low and colorless, the kind of gray that presses down on everything beneath it. Detectives gathered before sunrise, not because they were eager, but because waiting had become impossible. Every hour that passed felt like time borrowed from the truth. They didn't call it a search yet. Not officially. What they did instead was walk the land. The abandoned access road was barely recognizable now, choked by weeds and saplings that had grown unchecked for decades. Nature had done what it always does. It covered what humans hoped would stay hidden. The depression the contractor mentioned was subtle, almost polite in its concealment. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for a reason to notice it. And they were. Investigators spread out slowly, boots sinking slightly into soft ground. No one spoke. The quiet was thick, expectant. This wasn't the chaos of a crime scene. This was archaeology. Careful, respectful, heavy with implication. They marked boundaries, took photographs from every angle, compared soil texture, vegetation patterns. One area showed growth inconsistent with the rest, plants that thrived where others struggled. It meant nothing on its own. It meant everything in context. The decision to escalate came quickly after that. A warrant was requested, not for excavation, but for further forensic assessment. Prosecutors hesitated as expected. Digging without a body was a gamble. Digging with one would change everything. The line between those two outcomes was thin and unforgiving. Approval came late that afternoon. By the time ground-penetrating radar was brought in, word had begun to spread. Not officially. Not through statements. Through glances. Through whispers. Through the sudden presence of unmarked vehicles where none had been before. The radar scan was methodical. Grid by grid. Line by line. The technician moved slowly, eyes fixed on the monitor, expression unreadable. Detectives watched from a distance, every nerve tuned to the slightest change in posture. Then it happened. A pause. The technician stopped walking. called them over. On the screen, an anomaly, a disruption beneath the surface. Not rock, not root, something that didn't belong. The shape was indistinct, but the signal was unmistakable. The ground had been disturbed. No one celebrated. No one spoke. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had haunted this case for decades. This one had direction. Excavation teams were scheduled for the following morning. Overnight security was posted. The land was no longer forgotten. It was evidence. Elsewhere in town, someone else felt the shift. The person of interest didn't sleep that night. Neighbors would later say lights were on until dawn, that a car left and returned more than once, that curtains moved where they never had before. Detectives noticed too. They didn't intervene. Not yet. At sunrise, excavation began. The first layers came away easily. Leaves, loose soil, debris from years of neglect. Every shovel was controlled. Every inch documented. This wasn't a race. It was a conversation with the past. Then the soil changed. Darker. Compacted. Different. The foreman stopped the crew. A forensic anthropologist stepped in. Minutes stretched. Breath held. No one looked away. The first fragment wasn't immediately identifiable. Just bone. Weathered. Silent. But bone doesn't lie. Tells stories if you know how to listen. The work slowed further. Precision replaced momentum. As more material was uncovered, the outline emerged. Not complete, not dramatic, but enough. Human remains. 30 years of questions collapsed into a single devastating confirmation. Somewhere between relief and grief, the case crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer a disappearance. This was a homicide. News didn't break immediately. Law enforcement kept it contained, but towns have their own communication networks. By noon, everyone knew something had been found. By evening, everyone knew what it meant. The family was notified privately. No cameras, no statements, just truth delivered at last, heavy and irreversible. For them, closure didn't feel like peace. Felt like the end of waiting. Back at the dig site, investigators worked until darkness forced them to stop. More remains were recovered. Personal effects, fragments of clothing, items that once belonged to someone who had lived, laughed, planned for a future that never arrived. Each item was catalogued. Each one spoke softly of a life interrupted. The medical examiner began preliminary assessments on site. Estimated time of burial, evidence of trauma. Early indications suggested violence but not chaos. Controlled, intentional, the kind that happens when someone believes they won't be caught. Detectives felt it then. The certainty. Someone had known exactly where to bring the body. Somewhere remote. Temporary. A place that would change just enough to erase itself. This wasn't panic. This was planning. That night, investigators requested immediate interviews. The person of interest was brought in again. This time there was no pretense of casual conversation. The tone was firm. Grounded. Unavoidable. Detectives told them remains had been found. The reaction was instantaneous. Shock at first. Or something that looked like it. Eyes widening. Hands gripping the chair. A sharp intake of breath. Then something else slid underneath recognition. They asked where. Detectives didn't answer. They asked how investigators could be sure. Detectives said nothing. Silence filled the room again. But this time it wasn't defensive. It was calculating. The person realized the game had changed. That the story they'd lived with for decades no longer fit the evidence rising from the ground. Their attorney requested a pause. The interview ended. Outside, detectives didn't celebrate. They didn't speak much at all. The remains would be analyzed. Identified. Cause of death determined. Every detail mattered now more than ever. But they knew. They were standing on the edge of resolution and reckoning. The anonymous tipster never reached out again. Maybe they didn't need to. Because the truth was no longer fragile. It was solid. Unearthed. Impossible to ignore. And once a body is found, silence stops being protection. It becomes evidence. Once the ground gave up its secret, the town stopped pretending the story belonged to the past. People didn't say the name out loud in public at first, like speaking it might summon something worse. but they felt it in every pause between sentences, in every glance that lingered a fraction too long. A cold case doesn't warm up gently. It snaps awake. And now it was fully alive. The remains were transported under guard. No sirens. No spectacle. Just a quiet convoy moving through streets that had once been certain nothing like this could happen here. At the medical examiner's office, the case changed shape again. It became clinical. Measured. Exact. Every fragment documented. Every finding written in language designed to stand up under harsh light. Detectives waited in that uncomfortable space between knowing and proving. Finding the body had answered the biggest question, but it had also created a dozen new ones. Where had the person been held, if at all? How long had they been alive after leaving the house? What happened in the minutes that no one could account for? The calm scene, the unlocked door, the empty rooms, felt even colder now. It wasn't peaceful. It was staged. The forensic team began with identification. Because even when you're almost certain, the law demands certainty. Dental records, old medical files, any preserved artifact that could turn likely into confirmed. The family was asked questions that felt cruel in their precision: height, scars, habits, clothing last seen. But the family answered anyway, because they'd been answering for 30 years and they weren't about to stop now. While that process moved forward, detectives accelerated everything else. They treated every old statement as if it had been given yesterday, and they treated every old lie like it had just been spoken. The person of interest, now no longer just a figure in the margins, became a center of gravity. Not because detectives wanted it that way, but because the evidence pulled there again and again. They ran background checks that had never existed in 1995. They pulled employment histories, civil records, any complaint that had once been dismissed as a personal matter. Patterns emerged. Small conflicts. Quiet grudges. People who remember being intimidated, controlled, pushed, and then told themselves it was normal because in a small town, you don't like accusing someone without proof. Then they got proof of something else: movement. The soil analysis from the burial site indicated the ground had been disturbed using tools, not weather. That mattered. It meant time and effort. It meant the person who put the body there wasn't improvising. They were executing a plan with enough confidence to believe it would hold. Detectives revisited the road project records again. Now with urgency. The contractor's off-book dump had created a perfect hiding place. Fresh earth moved to a forgotten depression, quickly covered, then left to disappear under years of growth. It was the kind of luck criminals pray for. Or the kind of opportunity someone takes when they know the system well enough to exploit it. That line of thinking shifted the case toward another uncomfortable question. Did the killer understand law enforcement? Did they understand how investigations prioritize obvious scenes? How quickly a missing person case can cool if there's no immediate violence and no trail? Did they count on that calm, staged emptiness to buy them time? The answer felt like yes. In the interview room, the person of interest's attorney began calling more frequently, asking to clarify what was being alleged, asking what the department intended to do next. The tone wasn't curious anymore. It was strategic, like someone trying to measure the distance to the cliff without stepping too close. Detectives didn't reveal the burial site location. They didn't reveal all the forensic details. Instead, they used what they had always used in cases like this: pressure without exposure. Let the person sit with uncertainty. Let them wonder who had talked. Let them imagine the evidence they hadn't seen. Because fear fills gaps faster than facts. The town itself became a witness again. People who had stayed silent in 1995 started calling now. Not because they suddenly grew brave, but because the discovery of remains did something powerful. It gave permission to believe the worst. One caller reported hearing a story years ago, second-hand, unreliable but persistent, that someone had taken care of the problem back then. Another mentioned an argument in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, a moment where tempers flared in public, and then were smoothed over with forced smiles. Someone else recalled seeing the person of interest cleaning out a vehicle unusually thoroughly around that time, scrubbing like they were erasing a memory. Every call was logged. Most were weak. Some were usable. Together, they painted a picture of tension hidden behind routine. The medical examiner's early findings came back. The remains showed evidence consistent with homicide. The details didn't need to be dramatic to be devastating. The conclusion was enough. The missing person was now officially a murder victim. That single classification changed everything. Warrants became easier. Judges listened differently. Prosecutors leaned in. Detectives requested a warrant for the person of interest property. Home, storage spaces, vehicles, any place where time might have preserved something the killer assumed would be lost. When the warrant was served, it wasn't chaotic. It was clinical. Officers moved room to room with gloves and evidence bags, photographing everything before touching anything. In one storage area they found old tools, nothing illegal, nothing unusual. But among them, they found soil residue that didn't match the person's backyard. It was subtle. Most people would miss it. Forensic analysts did not. They also found records. Not diaries or confessions. Receipts. Notes. A few phone numbers scribbled on paper that had no innocent reason to still exist. One number matched the old line connected to the burner calls. Another matched someone the anonymous tip had hinted at indirectly, as if the tipster wanted investigators to find the connection without being forced to name it. Detectives sat with the evidence spread out again. They weren't chasing a single villain anymore. They were chasing a chain, one person who acted, and another who knew, and others who sensed something wrong and chose silence. Then a new development hit like a punch. A lab comparison from the recovered personal effects aligned with an item found in the storage box earlier. The one that contradicted the old statement. The connection wasn't just suspicious now. It was physical. It placed the person of interest closer to the victim than they had ever admitted. Detectives scheduled another interview. This time, the person arrived pale and rigid, accompanied by counsel, jaw tight as if holding back words. Detectives started gently, not because they were kind, but because they wanted the person to relax into the rhythm of lying before showing how fragile it had become. They asked about the night again. The same story came out, but now it sounded smaller, thinner, like fabric stretched too long. Then detectives introduced the physical linkage. The attorney objected, asked to see reports, demanded specifics. Detectives didn't argue. They simply stated what they could state and then waited. Silence is a tool. Used correctly, it becomes a mirror. People see themselves inside it. The person's eyes darted. Their hands tightened around a cup of water they didn't drink. They looked at their attorney the way someone looks at a life raft when the water rises. Detectives shifted the conversation to something else. Motives, relationships, resentments. They asked about the falling out that had never been documented. About the comment the coworker remembered. The warning disguised as advice. The person denied all of it, but the denial had changed. It wasn't confident anymore. It was defensive, frantic, as if each no was meant to plug a leak already flooding the room. Halfway through, detectives mentioned the burial site without naming it. Just enough to imply they knew more than they were saying. The person flinched. It was small, almost invisible, but detectives saw it. The interview ended without a confession, but it didn't need one. Confessions are endings. What investigators needed was momentum. And momentum arrived from an unexpected place. A relative of someone connected to the case, someone who had lived nearby in the 90s, called the department and asked to speak privately. Not on the phone. In person. They arrived after hours, wearing the expression of someone who had been carrying a heavy object for too long, and was finally ready to set it down. They said they had found something while cleaning out an old basement. A sealed envelope. No name on the outside. Just a date written in faded ink. 1995. Inside were notes. Not a full confession. Not a manifesto. Just fragments. A reminder list. A timeline. A few lines that didn't sound like planning a birthday party or a home repair. Lines that sounded like someone trying to keep their story straight. And tucked among the notes, a sentence that stopped detectives cold. You can't trust anyone. Especially not the one who called. Detectives sat back, feeling the room tilt. The anonymous tipster hadn't just been a conscience. They were part of the story. Maybe a witness. Maybe an accomplice. Maybe someone who knew enough to destroy everything and waited decades to pull the pin. And now, with the body found and the walls closing in, the cold case wasn't just broken. It was turning. The kind of turn that forces people to choose. Keep protecting the old lie or finally tell the truth. The sentence in the envelope didn't read like a warning from a stranger. It read like betrayal from someone who knew the room, The players knew exactly how fragile the silence was. Especially not the one who called. The words hung there, sharp and simple, slicing through every assumption detectives had built since the anonymous tip first arrived. For a moment, the case stopped moving forward and began moving inward, folding back on itself like a trap closing. Because if the tipster wasn't just a witness, then the tip wasn't just conscience. It was strategy. Detectives didn't rush to conclusions. They couldn't. An anonymous caller is a shadow by design, no name, no face, no easy way to test intent. But the envelope suggested something else. Someone had known there would be a call. Someone had anticipated it. Someone had been afraid of it long before it happened. That meant the caller was not random. The caller belonged to the story. They reopened the timeline of the tip itself. When it came in, what was said? What details were included? Which details were omitted? In the first call, the tipster had pushed doubt into the original timeline. In the later message, they had nudged detectives away from the obvious target, warning them they were asking the right questions but the wrong people. It had seemed helpful. Now it looked like steering. Detectives asked the simplest question. If you wanted to solve a cold case, why stay anonymous after the body was found? There were answers. Fear. Shame. Self-preservation. But there was also a darker possibility. The caller wanted credit without consequence, movement without exposure, an outcome they could control from a distance. The forensic document team analyzed the notes from the envelope. Handwriting. Ink. Paper age. Nothing miraculous, nothing cinematic, just careful science and careful comparison. The writing style matched a known pattern from a person connected to the case, someone who had once been close enough to know the details, and later distant enough to pretend they didn't. Detectives didn't announce this. They used it as leverage. They pulled every recorded contact associated with the original case and the reopened investigation. Old landlines. Work numbers. The burner line that had flared and vanished. They cross-referenced those numbers with relatives, friends, co-workers, anyone who could have owned a phone in 1995 and still recognized the power of anonymity now. The list narrowed. Then the medical examiner's confirmed identification returned, locking the victim's name back into the present with legal certainty. It wasn't just a missing person anymore. It was a person with a death certificate, a case number, and a cause that could be argued in court. The family received the confirmation in a quiet room, and outside that room, the town grew smaller. The kind of small where every glance feels like an accusation even when it isn't. Detectives moved to interviews again, but with a new target in mind. Not the person of interest at the center, at least not first. They went after the orbit. The people who had hovered near the edges for decades, collecting silence like a hobby. One of those people was the one detectives had tracked down out of state, the person who'd left town after 1995 and built a new life with a slightly altered name. When detectives contacted them again, the response was colder this time. Not defensive but tired. As if they had expected this day to come eventually and had rehearsed how to endure it. They agreed to meet, but only with counsel present. The interview began with routine questions. Where were you living in 1995? Who did you know? How often were you in town? Their answers were technical, careful, shaped by legal caution. Then detectives slid the envelope sentence across the table. Not the entire contents, just the part that mattered. Especially not the one who called. The person's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to register recognition. They said they didn't know what it meant. Detectives asked a different question, sharper and more direct. Did you call us? Silence. Counsel shifted in the chair. The air tightened. The person denied it. Quickly. Too quickly. Then added something unnecessary, something no one had asked. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't know how to do it without being traced. That line stuck. People who aren't thinking about traceability rarely mention it. Back in Illinois, detectives reviewed the person of interest's movements after the body was found. No direct evidence of tampering. No overt flight. But there were signs of stress, calls to certain numbers that hadn't been used in years, a sudden visit to a relative, a request for legal advice that came before official charges. They weren't running. Yet. They were preparing. The prosecution team met again. The question on the table was simple and brutal. Do we have enough to charge without a confession? Circumstantial cases can win. They can also collapse if even one juror believes the story could be coincidence. Prosecutors needed something cleaner. Something that tied the person of interest to the act, not just the aftermath. Something the defense couldn't wave away with faulty memory and poor record-keeping. So detectives returned to the burial site story. Because buried bodies don't just appear. Someone put it there. And someone knew where there was. They analyzed soil samples found on the person of interest's belongings. Not dramatic but specific. Soil composition varies. Certain minerals, certain textures, certain signatures can link one patch of earth to another with uncomfortable clarity. Lab results came back with a match strong enough to matter. It wasn't absolute, but it was persuasive. Detectives used it as pressure. They scheduled another interview with the person of interest, this time framing it as an opportunity. You don't have to carry this alone, they implied. You don't have to be the only one punished for something other people knew about. The person arrived with their attorney again. The attorney looked ready for war. Calm face, sharp eyes, a legal pad already filled with notes. The person looked smaller than before. Not physically, emotionally, like someone whose certainty had been eaten away night by night. Detectives didn't start with evidence. They started with the town, with the family, with the decades of waiting. They spoke in measured tones, not pleading, not scolding, just building the moral pressure that courtrooms can't always create. Then they brought in the caller. Not by name, by concept. Someone reached out, detectives said. Someone who knows more than you think. The person's eyes flicked. A tiny movement. Toward their attorney. Away from the detectives. Like a reflex. Detectives watched that reflex like it was a fingerprint. They slid the envelope sentence across the table again. Especially not the one who called. The person didn't touch the paper. They stared at it as if it could bite. Their attorney objected. Asked where it came from, demanded relevance, warned of hearsay. Detectives didn't argue. They let the attorney speak. Then they asked the person one question, quiet and lethal. Who would write that about you? The person swallowed. Silence stretched, and in that stretch detectives saw the internal math happening, the calculation of risk, the weighing of blame. The person's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Their attorney leaned in, murmured something. The person nodded once. No statement. But detectives didn't need a statement to know they'd hit something. That night, a break came from the one place cold cases often break. A relationship cracking under pressure. A person close to the out-of-state figure contacted detectives privately. Not the suspect themselves, but someone who loved them or used to, someone tired of defending a story that didn't make sense. They didn't come with a confession. They came with a memory. A late-night call years ago. A voice shaken. A sentence they never forgot. If they ever find it, it's over. At the time, it could have been anything. Now it had a shape. Detectives asked where the call came from. The answer matched a location near the old dumping area. Not proof, but alignment. Another thread tightening. Prosecutors authorized a final push, a grand jury subpoena for additional records, and a renewed request for cooperation from the out-of-state figure. Detectives offered something they hadn't offered before: protection, anonymity where possible, a chance to be seen as a witness rather than a participant, depending on what they disclosed. When the out-of-state figure heard this, they didn't respond immediately. Hours passed. Then a message arrived. Short, careful, and not anonymous. I'll talk. But not there. Not in that town. Fear still lived in them. Fear of people. Fear of history. Fear of what the truth would do once it escaped the room. Detectives agreed to meet on neutral ground. In the drive to that meeting, the case felt like it was breathing slow, heavy, alive. The kind of alive that means it's close to revealing its final shape. Because now there were two truths running side by side. The truth of what happened in 1995, and the truth of how it stayed hidden for 30 years. And in the space between those truths sat the anonymous tipster. No longer a mystery helper, but a living question. A question with a voice. A question that might finally speak with a name. The meeting happened in a place that felt intentionally forgettable. A neutral stretch of highway town. A conference room rented by the hour, beige walls and stale coffee. The kind of environment designed to absorb tension without reacting to it. Detectives arrived early. Not because they expected surprises, but because they needed control. In cold cases, control is oxygen. Without it, the past takes over. When the out-of-state figure walked in, they looked like someone carrying a secret that had become too heavy to lift. Not dramatic, not trembling, just exhausted. Their eyes moved constantly, door, window, floor, measuring exits the way people do when they've spent years expecting consequences. They sat down and didn't speak at first. Their attorney, new and unfamiliar to the Illinois team, laid out terms. No media. No local police in the room. No names spoken unless necessary. The entire posture of the meeting screamed one message. I will talk, but I will not be destroyed. Detectives agreed because they didn't come here to win an argument. They came here to win a case. They started with the easiest question. Not, did you do it? Not, are you the caller? Just, why now? The out-of-state figure inhaled slowly, as if choosing air carefully. Because you found them, they said. And because I can't pretend anymore that it's just a story. There it was. The first crack. Detectives didn't interrupt. They didn't rush to fill silence. They let it expand. The person's gaze drifted away, and when they spoke again, their voice was flatter, almost clinical, like someone recounting a disaster they survived by shutting off emotion. They said they had been in town in 1995. That much was already known. They said they knew the victim. Not deeply. Not family. Not some grand secret relationship, just familiarity, proximity, shared circles. Enough to recognize routines. Enough to know what normal looked like. Then they said something detectives hadn't expected. I didn't see what happened. I saw what came after. Detectives leaned in without moving. The person described a late-night contact. A request. Not a confession. Not a plea. More like a demand wrapped in urgency. They were told to meet someone. Someone detectives already had centered in the file. The person of interest. The one with the shifting timeline, the rehearsed denials, the attorney always one step ahead. When the out-of-state figure arrived, they said, the mood wasn't frantic. It was controlled. Tight. Like a room where someone is holding a door shut from the inside. They said it was an accident. The out-of-state figure continued. They said they needed help making it disappear. Help. That word landed like a stone. Detectives didn't celebrate. They didn't even nod. They just let the person keep talking because in cold cases the first admission is never the whole truth. The out-of-state figure said they refused at first. They said they didn't want to be involved. They said they were scared. They said the person of interest looked at them in a way that made fear feel logical. Then came the pressure. Not with weapons. Not with physical threats. With something quieter and often more effective, consequences. The person of interest, the out-of-state figure claimed, reminded them of things they didn't want exposed. Past mistakes. Old vulnerabilities. Small-town leverage. You think you can walk away, the person of interest allegedly said. But you're already here. The out-of-state figure's hands tightened on the edge of the table as they spoke. They looked like they wanted to climb out of their own skin. Detectives asked the question that had been burning since the envelope. Were you the one who called us? The out-of-state figure's jaw clenched. The attorney shifted. Finally, the person exhaled and said, yes. A confession, but not to the murder. To the tip. They said they called because they couldn't live with it anymore. Because time hadn't softened the memory. It had sharpened it. Because they watched the town move on while a family stayed trapped in a loop of not knowing. And because the person of interest had grown comfortable, too comfortable, talking about 1995 like it was a victory. Detectives asked why they stayed anonymous. Because if my name came out, the person said, I'd become the villain. And maybe I am. But I didn't want to be the only one paying for it. There was something raw in that. Not innocence. Not heroism. Just human fear and selfishness colliding with guilt. Detectives asked what exactly they did in 1995. The out-of-state figure hesitated, then gave a version that sounded like confession's cousin. Admission. They said they helped move something. They said they helped drive. They said they didn't plan the burial site, but they knew it was chosen because of the roadwork, because the earth would be disturbed anyway, because the town would be looking in the wrong direction while fresh soil did the hiding. They said they told themselves it wasn't their crime, that they were just cleaning up someone else's disaster, that they were just surviving. Detectives kept their faces neutral, because the law doesn't care about self-justification, and neither does the dead. Then the out-of-state figure said the line that made everything click into place. They weren't worried about being caught. They were worried about being known. Known. Not discovered. Not arrested. Known. It explained the calm, the staging, the obsession with controlling the story. It wasn't just about avoiding prison. It was about avoiding exposure, humiliation, the collapse of a life built on appearing untouchable. Detectives asked about the envelope. The out-of-state figure's expression hardened. That was them, they said. They wrote notes like that all the time. Reminders. Scripts. What to say. What not to say. They never trusted anyone. Not even me. Especially not me. Especially not the one who called, detectives repeated quietly. The out-of-state figure nodded once. The motion looked like surrender. The meeting ended with paperwork. Statements recorded. Terms discussed. Potential charges weighed. Cooperation wasn't immunity, but it was a path. Detectives promised what they could. Protection from immediate retaliation, consideration for truthful testimony, a chance to stop being a shadow and become a witness. When the out-of-state figure left the room, detectives sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight settle. They had what they needed now, not the entire story but the spine of it. A witness who could place the person of interest at the center of the aftermath. A witness who could explain the anonymous tip not as a miracle, but as guilt finally losing its grip. Back in Illinois, prosecutors moved fast. Warrants were updated. Arrest paperwork drafted but not filed yet. Strategy sessions ran late into the night, because charging someone in a 30-year-old homicide case is like building a bridge in a storm. Every bolt must hold. Detectives requested one final interview with the person of interest. They came in with counsel as always. The posture was stiff. The eyes colder than before. The attorney looked at detectives like they were insects on a windshield. Annoying, inevitable, easily dismissed. Detectives began with calm questions. Then they shifted. They didn't mention the out-of-state figure by name. Not at first. They just said, "Someone spoke." The person of interest smiled slightly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "People talk," they said. Detectives nodded. "Yes," they replied. "And sometimes they finally tell the truth." They slid a document across the table. Not a full statement but enough. Dates. Locations. A mention of the meeting. A detail only someone involved would recognize. The person of interest's expression didn't crack immediately. It tightened, as if the face itself became armor. The attorney demanded to know the source. Demanded disclosure. Demanded a halt. Detectives didn't argue. They simply watched the person of interest because reactions are evidence when words are controlled. The person of interest spoke slow and measured. "You're making deals with liars." Detectives replied gently. "We're giving you a chance to explain why your story has changed every time we ask." Silence. Then detectives said the simplest thing, the thing that rearranged the room. "We found them." For the first time, the person of interest flinched openly. Not a full collapse, just a visible break in the mask. Their hand moved slightly toward the edge of the table, as if to steady themselves. The attorney spoke quickly, trying to regain control, but control had shifted. The person of interest stared at the table the way someone stares at a crack spreading across ice. Detectives leaned in, not aggressive, not loud. "This has been a cold case for 30 years, they said. "You've lived 30 years with the truth. Now the truth has caught up." The person of interest swallowed. Their eyes flicked toward the door, then back. A trapped animal look. Not fear of detectives, but fear of what was coming next. The attorney ended the interview. Papers gathered. Chairs scraped back. The person of interest stood, stiff, and for the briefest moment their face revealed something that had been hidden since 1995. Not remorse. Not innocence. Just the realization that the story was over. Outside the station, the air was sharp with winter. The town lights flickered on as darkness fell, and somewhere, families ate dinner, watched television, tried to ignore the fact that history was about to be rewritten. Detectives filed the final requests. Prosecutors finalized charges. The case that had once been a manila folder marked cold was now a living thing, breathing toward an ending it had waited decades to reach. And the most haunting part was this. The anonymous tip that changed everything wasn't a miracle from nowhere. It was a conscience that waited too long. It was a witness who was also a participant. It was a reminder that the past doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. And now the past had a name. The arrest didn't come with flashing lights down Main Street or a dramatic chase through cornfields. It came the way real reckonings often come. Quiet, procedural, inevitable. Early morning. A knock at the door that sounded too similar to the one that started this story. Except this time someone answered. Officers stood on the porch with paperwork, not questions. The person of interest stepped outside in a coat they'd put on too quickly, hair still carrying the shape of sleep, eyes already calculating what the world would look like once they were taken from it. They didn't resist. They didn't scream innocence. They didn't collapse in tears. They looked like someone who had been waiting for decades, and was furious that waiting had ended on someone else's terms. The town watched without watching. Curtains shifted. A few faces appeared behind glass, then vanished. In small towns, everyone sees everything, and everyone pretends they saw nothing. That instinct had protected this case for 30 years. It wouldn't protect it now. Inside the station, prosecutors moved with precision. Charges were filed. The language was careful. Homicide, concealment, tampering, whatever the evidence supported. Anchored by the fact the ground had finally surrendered. The case was no longer built on absence. It was built on what remained. Bones. Soil. Records. Contradictions. And a witness who had finally traded silence for survival. When the press learned the cold case had broken, they called it shocking, but shock was a luxury for outsiders. For the family, it wasn't shock. It was the sound of a door finally opening after 3 decades of pounding. Their grief hadn't ended. It had simply changed shape. 4 years they had lived with 2 kinds of pain, the loss and the uncertainty. Now they were left with one, heavier in some ways because it came with clarity. They sat in a private room and heard details that never should have existed. Not graphic, not theatrical, just factual. Enough to confirm what they had feared and enough to confirm something they'd never allowed themselves to hope. They hadn't imagined it. They hadn't exaggerated. They hadn't been paranoid. The truth had been real the entire time. The courtroom process began in slow motion, like the law itself needed time to catch up to the past. Hearings. Motions. Arguments over what could be admitted, what could be challenged, what the jury might believe. Defense attorneys attack the case the way defense attorneys always do. Time erodes evidence, memories fade, witnesses are unreliable. They pointed at the decades between crime and charge like a shield. But the state pointed back at the decades as motive. Because time doesn't just erode. It also reveals patterns. It shows who stayed calm, who benefited, who lived without asking questions, who grew comfortable in the absence of answers. And then the out-of-state figure took the stand. Not at trial yet, but in preliminary testimony that would ripple through everything that followed. They entered the room like someone walking into a storm they helped create. Their voice shook once at the beginning, then steadied into something resigned. Their attorney sat close, expression tight. The witness wasn't here to be brave. They were here because the truth had finally boxed them in. They admitted to being the anonymous caller. They admitted to knowing more than they'd ever said. They admitted to being present in the aftermath. The courtroom didn't gasp. Real-life revelations don't always come with cinematic reactions. The shock was quieter than that. It was in the way people shifted in their seats. In the way a prosecutor paused. In the way the family stared forward, faces still, as if movement might break them. The witness described the night in fragments, because memory, when coated in guilt, doesn't replay cleanly. They recalled being contacted, being asked to come, being told something had gone wrong. They described the person of interest's demeanor. Controlled, urgent, obsessed with the story more than the act. They described the fear, not fear of the victim, but fear of exposure, fear of consequences, fear of being known for what had happened. The defense tried to paint the witness as the true villain. A liar seeking a deal. A coward hiding behind anonymity. The witness didn't deny any of it. They didn't defend themselves. That refusal to glamorize their own role made their words hit harder. They said they stayed quiet because silence was easier. Because denial is a comfortable drug. Because the town was the perfect place to hide in plain sight. People mind their business and the system moves on. They said they called decades later because they couldn't look at themselves anymore without hearing that night replay. And then, under direct questioning, they said the sentence that turned the case from circumstantial into personal. They told me back then that if anyone ever talked, they'd ruin them. They said they'd drag everyone down with them. The prosecutor asked who said that. The witness looked toward the defendant and spoke the name. In that moment, the town's old silence shattered. Not with noise but with confirmation. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was sworn testimony under oath. The defense objected, motioned, attacked credibility. But the damage was already done because now future jurors could imagine the scene. Not a faceless monster. Not a shadowy stranger. Someone local. Someone known. Someone who lived among them while the family waited and the town moved on. The medical examiner's findings followed. Cause of death stated in clinical terms. Evidence of violence. The kind that ends a life without leaving room for ambiguity. The details were presented without cruelty, but the courtroom still felt the weight. Because every fact was another nail in the coffin of the idea that this had been a mystery of chance. Then came the physical ties. Soil residue, records, contradictions in statements. The object found in storage. The timestamp that had first cracked the timeline. The utility usage that suggested activity where there shouldn't have been. Each piece alone could be debated. Together they formed a pattern with a direction. Toward a person who had built decades of normal life on top of a buried truth. The defendant finally spoke publicly through counsel. Denials. Outrage. Claims of witch hunts and deals with liars. The language was sharp, designed to create doubt. But doubt is fragile when the ground has already given up a body. And the town, this town that once lived on whispers, began to change. People talked openly now. Not because they were suddenly noble, but because the fear that had kept them quiet no longer had teeth. The most powerful illusion in any secret is that it will never be exposed. Once exposure becomes real, silence stops feeling safe. Old friends of the victim came forward with memories they had buried. Small moments. Odd comments. Things that didn't make sense until now. A strange car. A sudden argument. A person seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. These weren't breakthroughs, but they were confirmation. They painted the texture of 1995 with colors no one had dared use before. The family began the long, brutal work of learning how to live with answers. Because answers don't heal. They only end one kind of suffering and replace it with another. The victim's name returned to the town's vocabulary not as a rumor, but as a person who mattered, who had been taken, who had been mourned without proof for too long. When the case became headlines, the words were sharp. Cold case broken. Anonymous tip. Arrest shocks community. But what the headlines could never capture was the quieter truth. The shock wasn't the arrest. The shock was how long it took. How many times someone almost spoke and didn't. How many small-town instincts, don't get involved, don't make trouble, don't accuse without proof, built a wall around a crime so effectively that decades passed before anyone dared knock it down. And yet the wall fell. Not in one dramatic collapse. In cracks. In timestamps. In old receipts. In a contractor remembering a separate dump. In a sealed envelope in a basement. In a conscience that waited too long but finally moved. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a murder in Illinois in 1995. It was a story about silence as a weapon. About how ordinary lives can become camouflage. About how guilt can sleep for decades and still wake up screaming. Because even after the court dates and motions and testimony, even after the verdict that would eventually come down like a final hammer, the town would carry something else. The awareness that the truth had been there the whole time, hidden not only by one person's actions, but by everyone's willingness to look away. And on certain nights, when the streetlights hum and the wind moves through trees that weren't there in 1995, people will remember how this began. A knock. A quiet house. A missing life. A cold case. They will remember how it ended too. Not with a miracle, not with a hero, but with a voice that finally broke the silence and changed everything. And that's the real haunting part. Because the past didn't come back as a ghost. Came back as evidence. Came back as a name. It came back as the truth that had been waiting under the ground the whole time.